I'd just like to follow up a little bit from last night's class in workbook 2, because there's going to be some things in the Torah portion, Matot, that touch on, well, I don't know if they touch, they intersect. Just like, after class last night, we were trying to think about, in terms of Revelation, there are so many additional layers of sevens, as like the seals and the trumpets and the bowls and so forth. How does that look exactly? I think it's hard to visualize. I forget what I called it, maybe a dance of chiasms and so forth, that from the natural level, it might be difficult to really wrap our minds around it. And maybe that's part of the mystery of Revelation. I don't know that Revelation is so much a mystery of content. It's not. Because if we're patient and we take long enough, we can go back through the Torah and we can pretty much place everything in Revelation down in a Torah portion. Remember, that's what I said. Make yourself some note cards with the titles of the Torah portions, and then make in your own words summaries of the topics. Just like last week's Torah portion, it seemed like it was a bunch of different topics, and it really wasn't. This week's Torah portion can seem like different topics, but it really isn't. There are thematic threads that tie them together. And so last night we reviewed a little bit from Revelation 7, 9 through 17, because I don't know that I can say enough in terms of the fall feast, especially as they're approaching. They're coming fast, guys. I don't know how it happens after Shavuot. I think we kind of, I don't want to say let our guard down a little bit, but we tend to, gear back. We're getting into summer. We're outside. We're doing summer things. Well, probably not in South Africa. They're probably doing winter things right now. But after Shavuot, we know we've got some time. And what do we tend to do when we know we have a little bit of time? We quit rushing so much. We allow ourselves to focus on different topics. But then all of a sudden we look up, and all of a sudden the 3 weeks are upon us. We start talking about things like Tisha B'Av and the destruction of the temple, and that really starts setting the tone to prepare us for the fall feast. And there's a reason for that, because as John describes the fall feasts for the world, they are apocalyptic events occurring within the fall feast. Not that there won't be in the spring, but the message to Thyatira, which remember was the metal assembly, has to do with Shavuot. From Shavuot on, it says, they will be thrown into great tribulation. So maybe Passover was a tribulation, but as we draw into the fall feast, we get great tribulation. Bad news. But for the saints, as we were reading last night, that conclusion of the sixth seal at Yom Kippur is actually a good thing, because at that point he spreads the sukkah. He says, I will spread my tabernacle over them. And the time marker there, because we were talking about this after class last night, how can we tell at what time these things occur? I don't think we can. But we'll get little clues, like, after these things I looked, and behold. So at least at this point in the narrative, John is saying, okay, there were these things that happened before, and then I'm giving you a time marker, and what is about to follow, I can say, will surely follow that. I don't know if everything else we read in Revelation is actually a following thing or a simultaneous thing. Sometimes I think these things are occurring simultaneously, according to that pattern of the sevens. But as we went through that passage in Revelation 7, we realized there definitely is a theme shift into the royalty and the throne and the kingdom aspects that are associated traditionally with the fall feasts, like being clothed in white robes, standing before the throne. They're before the throne of God. He spread his tabernacle over them. the Lamb in the center of the throne. And so in that one passage, you start counting up how many times it either says the word throne or something king, kingdom related. You really do have the GPS that he's talking about the fall feasts. And we get the hints, like clothed in white robes. When would you wear a white robe? You would wear it at Rosh Hashanah, at the Feast of Trumpets. And actually what's going to follow is the sounding of the 7 trumpets. And it's in the Torah portion too. There is a sounding of trumpets that's going to be within someone's hand in a time of war. And there again, we've got another little clue for Revelation. When trumpets sound, we can go back to the Torah portion, Matot, which is where we found at least a seed prophecy of where these 144,000 sealed warriors may come from. But we've got the throne popping up, which again, we may not get it explicitly from the Torah that the throne is the theme of the fall feast, but when we read the associated Psalms with the fall feast, especially the Feast of Trumpets, it starts in context going through, mentioning the throne and the kingdom and subduing the nations, which is what you see Yeshua doing in the book of Revelation. So when it says after these things, I think that's a transition phrase for us. At least for the saints, we know that there's a transition between those 6 working days and the 7th day of rest, or Sukkot. Now remember, within each of the 7 feasts, there will be at least one full high Sabbath, right? So what is a characteristic of a moed? Even if you have chol moed in between this Shabbat and this Shabbat, say of Pesach or Sukkot, there will be at least one in each feast that will be set apart, no work, a complete rest. So the picture here we have is of every nation, tribe, and tongue. And as we go over, I was actually on page 52 of workbook 2. And I wanted to look at page 55. And it's from Ecclesiastes 12, 11 through 14, which again, the shepherd was mentioned in Revelation 7. Now here in Ecclesiastes, and last night we talked about Yirat Adonai and how it relates to Chokhmah, or wisdom, and how they're a continuous thing. One blends into the other. The beginning of wisdom is the reverence, the respect, the awe of Adonai. So the preacher tells us, and by the way, this is the book that we read at Sukkot, if that helps. The particular books that we read for particular feast days will tend to give us, from John's viewpoint in Revelation, the themes he would expect to be associated with those feasts, like Thyatira, the book of Ruth, and being a servant, and so forth. So he says, the words of wise men are like goads, and masters of these collections are like well-driven nails. They are given by one shepherd. Okay, there's the shepherd again. But beyond this, my son, be warned, the writing of many books is endless. An excessive devotion to books is wearying to the body. There again, like we were saying last night, balance, balance, balance. The conclusion, when all has been heard, and this is the same conclusion we get in the book of Revelation, by the way, is to fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. That's exactly what we're seeing in the book of Revelation. Every nation, tribe, and tongue is being tested as to whether they fear God, whether they have Yirat Adonai and keep his commandments, because it applies to everyone. It says, for God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. So he's saying it's not just enough to say you fear God and to keep the commandments in a ritualistic sense, because he extends here the judgment. It says everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. So it's not just your outward keeping of the commandments, it's the commandment that's written on the heart that really counts. That's what the preacher is preaching. And who is he preaching to? The 7 assemblies of Revelation, for one. Why? Because they represent the 7 feasts and the 7 times that Israel would be expected to gather and to be that light to the nations. So when people see us gather at the 7 feasts, they may not get every message of that particular feast as we understood it, at the depth at which we engage it. But there should be a takeaway for the nations, just like with Jonah going to Nineveh. How much could he preach in that short amount of time that would bring them to repentance? You know, do you think they were keeping glatt kosher? Not in that short degree of time, but he preached a takeaway message, probably had to do with idolatry. So it's the heart, right? And we know Yeshua can grow people up by the heart. Now, last night I was showing the class a book called Or Yisrael, which is a book on Musar, which is character development. And it gave us that same message as it concerned Yirat Adonai, the reverence of Adonai, and it having to come from the heart. But the only way you get to the heart of the thing, and it says, you're like a treasure. You have a key to the inner vault, but you don't have a key to the outer vault that surrounds it. Why? Because it takes the action of Yirat Adonai to break through that outer barrier. You literally have to break down this outer wall, right, in order to get into the vortex, in order to get into the inner places, the heart of the Torah, the heart of the Spirit working in you. You have to exert an effort. And the only way that you will exert that effort to break through the part that you don't have the key to is with a true passion and developing a respect and an awe of Adonai. That's how you get to the heart of the Torah. Otherwise, what Musar is telling us is just head knowledge. And you've got the key and you really can't get in there. Why? Because you never developed Yirat Adonai, the most fundamental thing. He can judge that because, see, we could still go through doing commandments and they say you still not turned the key. Because you never, out of studying the commandments, it never developed in you a sense of reverence and awe for the Holy One. It just made you smarter. It didn't make him smarter. See, the more we read his word, the smarter we know he is and the dumber we feel. And it should be like that because his wisdom is infinite and ours is finite. But if the reverse is happening, and you see this all the time, people study scripture and they just get smarter and smarter and smarter. And they really need God, he needs to just kind of sit down and be quiet because they have the proper interpretations of things. God needs their help. Otherwise, you see what I'm saying? Knowledge can puff up. It can bring in pride. And so I wanted to bring in, because we're talking, going from the 6th to the 7th seal, I wanted to bring a little bit more from the Yom Kippur service. Like I say, there'll be a theme in our Torah portion that's going to intersect this. But it has to do with what must have taken place by the conclusion of the 6th seal. These confessions and this atonement has to have occurred in order for you to pass basically under the tabernacle. Like he's saying, I will spread my tabernacle over them. one of the, and the reason we're going to get into this is because of the actual sin that is incurred when we don't keep our word. That's in the Torah portion. When we don't keep our word, we incur sin. And so here are some of the prayers that are prayed at Yom Kippur. That's not even going to help. Teeny tiny, longer on. It says, we have become guilty. We have betrayed. We have robbed. And by the way, if you ever look this up in a Hebrew text, you will see that it's numbered by letter. Just like Psalm 119. Just like we've been looking at the 7 seals as 7 Hebrew letters. That's the way it's marked in this Siddur, by the way. So we have become guilty. We have betrayed. We have robbed. We have spoken slander. We have caused perversion. We have caused wickedness. We have sinned willfully. We have extorted. We have accused falsely. We have counseled evil. We have been deceitful. We have scorned. We have rebelled. We have provoked. We have turned away. We have been perverse. We have acted wantonly. We have persecuted. We have been obstinate. We have been wicked. We have been corrupted. We have been abominable. We have strayed. We have turned away from your commandments and from your good laws, but to no avail. What can we say before you, who dwells on high? What can we relate to you, who abides in the highest heavens? For indeed, everything that is hidden and revealed, you know. That's exactly what Ecclesiastes is saying. God will bring every act into judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. And that's a pretty good list right there. And most of the time we can do all that in 5 minutes on Facebook, right? That's the short list. This, which is called the Al-Chet, all right? And I know there's a rumor that goes around Hebrew root circles that there was no sacrifice or there was no atonement for willful sin. I beg to differ. Anybody who's ever gone through the Yom Kippur service and done the Al-Chet with the congregation, there is a confession and a request for forgiveness for willful sin. And it starts out that way. It says, for the sin that we have sinned before you under duress and willingly. For the sin we have sinned before you through hardness of heart. For the sin we have sinned before you without knowledge. And for the sin that we have sinned before you with the utterance of the lips. For the sin we have sinned before you through immorality. And for the sin that we have sinned before you in public or in private. For the sin we have sinned before you with knowledge and with deceit. And for the sin that we have sinned before you through harsh speech. For the sin that we have sinned before you through wronging a neighbor. And for the sin that we have sinned before you through inner thoughts. That was really the thing I wanted to bring out in the Al-Chet, was not just, yes, there is atonement for willful sin at Yom Kippur. And that's why it's great to have Yeshua as a high priest who can go into the Holy of Holies. But right here, it's emphasizing the sin that we have sinned through inner thoughts. If we only think it, we still incur sin. Isn't that what Yeshua said? If you're doing it in your heart, you've already done it. Now, it may not have the same victim impact, all right, as if you actually execute that thought upon the person. But that thought process still has to be purified. If we are going to ascend, up, remember, like Caleb said, up we shall go. Well, we might get into the lower garden, but if we don't deal with things like this there and learn better, then you certainly don't want to be standing before the throne. Why? Because every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil, even if it's in the thought process. For the sin that we have sinned before you in a session of vice. For the sin that we have sinned before you through insincere confession. For the sin that we have you ever just told us, oh, I'm sorry, and then just make them shut up? Okay, that's insincere. For the sin that we have sinned before you by showing contempt for parents and teachers. For the sin that we have sinned before you willfully and carelessly. For the sin we have sinned before you by exercising power. For the sin that we have sinned before you through desecration of the name. There again, that's going to touch in this Torah portion. For the sin that we have sinned before you through impure lips. For the sin that we have sinned before you through foolish speech. For the sin that we have sinned before you with the evil inclination. And for the sin that we have sinned before you against those who know and against those who do not know. Right? Sometimes we sin against people and they know it, and sometimes they have no idea. Both of those need atonement. For all these, O God of forgiveness, forgive us, pardon us, atone for us. And that's just, again, the beginning. For the sin that we have sinned before you through denial and false promises. I'm interested in these false promises because, again, it touches on our Torah portion. If you make a vow, if you say you're going to do something, you had better do it. Otherwise, you're incurring a sin that requires atonement. And you may also be sinning in such a way that brings the penalty of that sin onto someone else. For the sin we have sinned before you by subservience through bribery. For the sin that we have sinned before you through scorning, sarcasm, guilty. For the sin that we have sinned before you through evil talk. For the sin that we have sinned before you in commercial dealings. For the sin we have sinned before you in food and drink. For the sin that we have sinned before you through interest and extortion. And for the sin we have sinned before you through haughtiness. For the sin that we have sinned before you with the idle chatter of our lips. For the sin that we have sinned before you with prying eyes. For the sin that we have sinned before you with haughty eyes. And for the sin that we have sinned before you with brazenness. For all these, O God of forgiveness, forgive us, pardon us, atone for us. For the sin we have sinned in throwing off your yoke. And for the sin that we have sinned before you in judgment. For the sin that we have sinned before you through entrapping a neighbor. And for the sin that we have sinned before you through a begrudging eye. Remember the evil eye? For the sin that we have sinned before you through lightheadedness. And for the sin that we have sinned before you with obstinacy. Hello, it's got my name on it. For the sin that we have sinned before you with legs that run to do evil. Remember, everything's going to go back to the wicked lamp here. For the sin that we have sinned before you by gossip mongering. For the sin that we have sinned before you through vain oath taking. This is our Torah portion. For the sin that we have sinned before you through baseless hatred, which destroyed the second temple, by the way. For the sin that we have sinned before you in the matter of extending a hand. And for the sin that we have sinned before you through confusion of the heart. And those as well are lettered Aleph through Tav. Just like the Vidui, the first one that I read, I said it had the Hebrew letters in it. The Al-Chet also goes from Aleph to Tav. So in terms of Yeshua saying he's the Alpha and the Omega, he's the Aleph and the Tav, do you think Yeshua is capable of atoning for all these sins? Absolutely. For all of these, O God of forgiveness, forgive us, pardon us, atone for us. And for the sins for which we are obligated to bring an elevation offering, remember that's the Olah. And for the sins for which we are obligated to bring a sin offering, we've already been through a lot of those. For the sins for which we are obligated to bring, this is calling it a variable offering. It's like it's almost like not a mixture, but it has different components to it. For the sins for which we are obligated to bring a guilt offering, for a definite or a possible sin, for the sins for which we incur lashes for rebelliousness, for the sins for which we incur the death penalty, for the sins for which we incur spiritual excision, for the sins for which we incur the 4 death penalties of a human court, stoning, burning, beheading, strangling, for a positive commandment, for a negative commandment. This covers everything. When you go into the synagogue on Yom Kippur, anything you could have possibly done or thought about doing is pretty much covered from the Aleph to the Tav, twice. You're going to start out with the Vidui, and then you go to the Achet. So as we're reading Ecclesiastes, and he reminds us, because remember Ecclesiastes would be read at Sukkot, he's reminding us to go back basically to our Yom Kippur lessons. And if we want to be part of that every nation, tribe, and tongue, then we also have to be part of Yom Kippur. We also have to have the forgiveness and the atonement for our sins, which means Yeshua is a necessary component. What else did I have marked in there? Oh, this too. Again, this is specifically for Yom Kippur, and I wanted to tie it in to Revelation 7 for you, how many times the throne comes up as a theme. There's a section that you do, I think more than once. This one's from the Shacharit, and it starts out, O King, Hamelech. It says, who is sitting upon a high and lofty throne. He who abides forever, exalted and holy is his name. And it is written, sing joyfully, O righteous, before Hashem. For the upright, praise is fitting. Is this what they're doing in Revelation 7? With the 6th seal, Yom Kippur? For by the mouth of the upright, and these are upright people before the throne, you shall be exalted. By the lips of the righteous, you shall be blessed. By the tongue of the devout, you shall be sanctified. And amid the holy, you shall be lauded. That is exactly the situation of Revelation 7 and those who are gathered around that high and lofty throne. It says that in the assemblies of the myriads of your peoples, the house of Israel, with joyous song, shall your name be glorified, our King, throughout every generation, for such is the duty of all creatures before you, Hashem our God, God of our forefathers, to laud, praise, glorify, exalt, adore, render triumphant, bless, raise high, and sing praises, even beyond all expressions of the songs and praises of David, the son of Jesse, your servant, your anointed. And it goes on, basically with the themes of the throne. Again, and so if you can, this one was not expensive, but it's because the print is about the size of a gnat's tattoo. But if you can get a full-size one of those and not harm your vision, it's worth before Yom Kippur, because see, once you get into the fellowship on Yom Kippur and you start going through the prayers, you're hungry and you're distracted. It helps to go through the prayers and at least read them like this before you go into the hunger stage. I would recommend, at least once during the days of between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, get a hold of those Yom Kippur prayers and see if they don't start lighting up passages in Revelation for you, like Revelation 7. Because they're doing exactly what they would be expected to do in a synagogue on Yom Kippur, gathering around the throne, praising, singing, and so forth. Okay, now we're going to go on to the Torah portion. Since we know we have to keep our word, or we've got Yom Kippur business. I'm busy every Yom Kippur. And it starts in Numbers 30, verse 2. And the section starts with the vow. All right. And a vow is a promise to do something. A promise to do something. Now, you can do a word search in your Strongs, and you can expand that definition. And I encourage you to do it if you have time this week or on Shabbat. If you have time on Shabbat, look up all the possible definitions of a vow, which is neder. Neder. So it would be Nun, Dalet, Resh. We've got, in the Mishnah, we've got a section called Nedarim, which means vows. Over the centuries, Jews have sat down and they've examined all the ins and outs of taking a vow and pretty much set up guidelines about it. But to boil it down to its essence, when you swear an oath, when you promise somebody that you're going to do something, then your word is full of power. What was the name of the Yom Kippur book? This one is Art Scroll, and it's going to say the complete Art Scroll Machzor. Machzor is spelled Machzor. And this one, you'll notice it's very tiny, but I think you could get the full size one. And it came as a set with the Rosh Hashanah. So you've got one prayer book for Rosh Hashanah, and then you've got another prayer book for Yom Kippur. And what you'll notice is there's a lot of repetition. But the confessional prayers that you see in the Yom Kippur Machzor, you will not see those so much in the Rosh Hashanah. What you will see is more of that Hamelic imagery. As you read through the Rosh Hashanah Machzor, it's going to be kingdom, throne, on high, the peoples will bow down to you, and those sorts of passages, just like we're getting them in Revelation. It's very consistent. And so Rosh Hashanah is supposed to be a joyous day, even though it's a very grave day. It's a day of judgment. But it's also, there's intended to be a certain joy associated with it. And I think it's because of the resurrection. Because of the resurrection of the dead. Yes, there are decrees that go out at Rosh Hashanah concerning whether you live or you die on a routine year, but there will be a year, there will be a Rosh Hashanah when it's not so much about the decrees upon the righteous, because their decree is being fulfilled at that moment, and they're being caught up and basically being prepared around the throne to go under that tabernacle that he's going to spread, that sukkah. There, from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, there's great spiritual events happening, but ultimately for the righteous, they'll go into the sukkah and for a time of protection, whereas the harsh judgments are still going on in the world. They are also being rewarded, but they're being rewarded according to what they have requested through their behavior or their lack of repentance. So if you're looking for something like this, just look under Machzor, and then you might have to check the description to see whether it's for Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah, and I recommend them both. There's passages in there that can be life-changing. Once you see that what we're reading in the New Testament is very much founded in the same themes as what's being practiced in the synagogue during the High Holy Days. So, excuse me. It says, if a man takes a vow to Hashem or swears an oath, all right, and as it goes on, what I wanted to draw out about it we know that we're expected to keep our word when we make a promise, when we make an oath. What interested me was verse 3. It says, he shall not profane his word. According to whatever comes from his mouth, he shall do. So you can see why Yom Kippur would be a great thing. If you spoke foolishly during the course of the year and you made a vow, you can't just act like that didn't happen if you didn't fulfill it. When you make a vow, when you make a promise and you don't fulfill it, then sin enters in. And that's why I said it's better not to vow. Just do it. You don't have to say you're going to do it. Just do it if you want to do it. Because if you don't say you're going to do it, then you've not created the condition where now you've got an obligation. And if you don't fulfill it, now you're going to incur sin that you're going to have to request forgiveness for. And so it starts out with the male. And it says, if he doesn't perform this vow, if he doesn't fulfill what he says, assuming he's a full-grown male, he shall not profane his word. And that word there, let me see if I can pull it up and do a share screen. Here it is. There, I don't know how well you can see that. That's just Blue Letter Bible I've got pulled up. But I want you to see here, halal. If that were a he instead of a chet, you would have halal, which would be praise. But if you use a chet, right? And remember the passage we just read out of the Yom Kippur liturgy for forgiveness was called al chet. Why? Because chet is the form of chetat, which means sin. Al chet. Well, we're just saying we're not making prayers on the sin, we're making prayers on the forgiveness of the sin. So he plays with the letters to remind us that with one little mistake with your pen, you can go from praise to sin. You can go from halal to halal. And you don't usually want halal because of its context. And so it's Strong's 2490. And in this use, it's a verb. And the interesting thing is it's used most often to mean to begin something. So what happens when you make a vow or you make a promise? You open something up. You open up a pathway with the promise that I'm coming behind my word with the intention to perform it. But if you never do it, it stays empty. You've used empty words. And here's what happens. It says to profane, to defile, to pollute, to desecrate. So what's happening? In the nifal, it means to profane yourself, to defile yourself, to pollute yourself. That's the reason you want to keep your promises, or be careful how many promises you make. Because when you don't keep your promise, when you don't keep your vow, you profane yourself. You defile yourself and you pollute yourself. And then you find yourself in need of forgiveness because you started something you didn't finish. You began it, but you didn't execute it. So the second most popular use of it in Scripture is literally to profane. And as we look at the context, and there again, if you've got time to look up neder, which means vow, what are all the potential meanings of vow? Go ahead and look this one up too. All right, because it's giving you 52 usages where it means to begin something. And in fact, if I'm not mistaken, the first use of it in a verb form goes back to the days of Noah when men began to call on the name of the Lord. And it brought the earth, has different implications, obviously, than halal praise. But it drew the earth into such a state of pollution that it had to be cleansed. So they weren't just desecrating themselves and defiling themselves with this beginning, whatever it was, opening things up with words and then not executing it. It defiled the whole earth in the days of Noah. So that's why we want to be careful as we look through here. Like one of the meanings, it means to wound fatally. Empty words, can they be literally fatal? I don't know. But it does wound you. And specifically, it wounds your reputation. You know, there's a saying in English that your word is your bond. And always growing up, I thought your word is your bond meant like the connection between you and your, you know, what you intend to do. But then as I got into law enforcement, I realized what a bond was. It's a guarantee. If I make bond, I pay this amount of money and it says I will be back for my court date. It costs me something. And it's the same thing with our word. If we're a no-show on our word, we forfeit our bond. Our word is our guarantee. It's like money. I put my money on it, and that's my promise. If I put my word on it, that's my promise. And if I'm a no-show to my word, then that's wounding not just my reputation, it's bringing me into a condition of sin. That's why it says, don't delay to perform your vow in case something happens. If you wait too late, something might happen that would prevent you. Even though you want to perform it, you could get sick. Any number of things could happen. Or if you make a promise to a sick person, what if they die before you can execute the promise? If you said, I'll mow your grass, and 3 years later, you're saying, well, I'm going to do it. And the next door neighbor dies before you mow her grass, right? Then you don't have any way of fulfilling that vow to her. You have to hurry to perform your word. And then it goes on and it extends this idea of he shall not profane his word. Let me take off there we go. And it goes on and it starts talking about a young woman who is really not of a mature age. She would be somewhere between the age of 11 or 12 and marriage. She would not likely have been fully married. Understand that in this system, there were steps of marriage, whereas today they go straight from this step to this step in the same ceremony. Back then, a lot of times it might be years from the betrothal to the giving of an object like a ring or a piece of jewelry, and then to the actual consummation of the marriage, where she would go into her husband's house. She would spend a lot of time still in her father's house, still married, but never having consummated the marriage. Nevertheless, the same conditions applied. She was prohibited to other men. So a woman in this, she's typically a teenager. And we all say stupid things when we're teenagers. And aren't we glad that we're not expected to perform everything we said we would do when we were teenagers, right? You know, thank heaven for Yom Kippur. Because when we say the word, like the text is saying, if we don't do according to, it says, whatever comes from his mouth, then he is profaning his word. He's bringing this defilement upon himself. And then it extends over to the female, the same conditions apply. If she's a mature woman, or if she's divorced, or if her husband's deceased, she's expected to perform it. Or again, she has profaned her word. And if her father or her husband, if she's that young woman, that na'ara, he has to nullify the vow before sundown. And this is taken from the text. He doesn't have 24 hours. If he hears the young lady's vows and he knows this would cause her damage, or she's probably, you know, when we're young, we tend to overestimate our ability. But a more adult, mature person can look and say, hey, that's not a great promise to make. Because a 12-year-old might tell the neighbor, yes, Miss Lucy, I'll come over there and I'll mow your grass twice a week for the next 6 years. And you know good and well that kid's not going to go do that, right? And you say, well, let's not promise that. Let me annul that vow. All right, let's say I want to help you with your grass. The end. And then he is free to execute as much or as little as he is able to do according to his age and his strength and his ability and any other thing that might come in the way, like being gone on a family vacation or being in Israel for the feast or whatever. Pull back on the promise and just say, I would like to. I will make an attempt to. But you don't get in nearly as much trouble by being less specific as you do by being more specific, because that word truly is your bond. I'll be back. I've opened this thing up now with my words, and now I've got to go through and I've got to perform it. And according to this text, the way that it's worded, if the father or the husband hears the vow and intends to nullify it, he has to do it before sundown that day. It has to be that day. He can't wait until sundown because it starts a new day. So he may have 23.59 hours to nullify it, but he may have a second to nullify it if he hears of it right before sundown. But it has to be on that day that it's annulled. And if not, or if he does annul it, it says in chapter 30, verse 9, if on the day, that's where they're getting this, if on the day of her husband's hearing, he shall restrain her, and he shall nullify her vow that is upon her, or the utterance of her lips by which she had prohibited something upon herself, then Hashem will forgive her. See, it requires a forgiveness. We would like to say, well, I just didn't keep my word. I said I would do it, I didn't do it. And maybe the person I made the vow toward doesn't even know it. It doesn't matter. You said it. And you said it out loud. And this is what Rashi says in the commentary. It says, our verse teaches that one who commits a sin requires forgiveness, not only for the act, but for the intention. If one who merely thinks she is sinning needs forgiveness for the intention, all the more so one who actually sins. And this is going back to, let's see which verse we're talking about right here. It goes back up to verse 6, where it says, and Hashem will forgive her. This is what happens when the vow is nullified, which means she thought it. Now, she was exempt once it was nullified, right? But it still had to be forgiven. Do you see that in the text? It's kind of subtle, and maybe we never thought about it before. because we are very loose with our words. But here, she had thought to execute. And so, even though the words themselves have been nullified, she still needs forgiveness for the intention that could not be carried out. And so if we need forgiveness for intents that were never carried out, he's saying, how much more if we said it and didn't do it? Which is why you get in the Al-Khayt, it's so complicated and so long when it's saying, forgive us for this, forgive us for that, forgive us for this. Like you said, for just intention that we didn't execute, for wrong intentions. And that's not a bad thing. Because if you think of the purity that's going to be required in the garden, we want total purity. We don't want just, oh, I thought it, but I didn't do it. We want, I didn't even think about it. And if I didn't even think about it, there was no possibility I could even do it. And it has to do with the soul. If we look at verse 7, it says, if she shall be married to a man and her vows are upon her. And this is interesting in the Hebrew, if her vows are upon you. When you make a promise, where is the promise? So I was telling the class last night after class, I said, every now and then, go in a restaurant, sit down, listen to the buzz around you, and try to imagine what every single word looks like as it's coming out of people's mouths. If you can visualize that, that's like practice. Like when we release words into the spiritual realm, we can't see them, so we don't think about them. But if you just sit in a restaurant and think how much more the Holy One can hear every word coming out of every mouth and judge every word as it goes out. And it says, if she shall be married to a man and her vows are upon her, right? That's aliyah. They're on her head. When you make a promise, it's on your head. It's overhead. And when you've got overhead, you have something to fulfill. And then it goes on and it says, al nafsha, an utterance of her lips by which she had prohibited something upon herself. Vows tend to deal with the soul. A discipline of the soul. Typically, we say we're either going to do this extra thing, or in the same sense, if we withdraw from something that is permitted to us, that's still an extra thing because we didn't have to. I mean, we're always going to eat kosher, but if you said, okay, I'm sensing that my appetite is out of control and I don't want to be a glutton, and so therefore, I'm going to prohibit myself from eating fried chicken. I don't know, I'm making something up here. No fried chicken for me for the next 6 months. If it's something that causes you to overindulge and take you out of balance, well, that's an extra thing. Because there's nothing in the Torah that tells you can't have fried chicken. And if you live in Kentucky, you're going to have Kentucky Fried Chicken, right? And as it turns out, they have Kentucky Fried Chicken anywhere I've gone in the world. So it's kind of weird. But it's your soul. It's your appetite that you're dealing with typically. Why? To open up that pathway to the spirit. Why is your spirit having so much trouble getting you in the line? Because the soul rise up. And so here it says it's on her soul. She had made this vow and now it's on her soul. It's on her head. It's on top of her. It's hanging over her head. Why? Because it's on her soul. And it says it again. The vow of a widow or a divorcee, anything she has prohibited upon herself shall be upheld upon her. And so there's kind of a double thing going on there. It says, al nafsha, on her soul, yakum, kum means stand up. Like kumi ori, arise and shine. She will stand it up basically on top. All right, what does that tell you about your words? When you give your word, you have to make that your first priority. It has to be upheld. Otherwise, you're going to enter into a condition of sin. In the next, where is it? Chapter 30. Which again, going down to verse 15, it says, if her husband shall be silent about her from day to day, he will have upheld all her vows. In other words, if a day passes, if it passes into the next day, now he's her surety. He has to make sure that she fulfills that vow. If he lets it cross into another day and he didn't nullify it, right? Why does it say, but if he shall nullify them after his having heard, he shall bear her iniquity. So it's teaching us lessons about our words. Just making promises we don't keep can bring iniquity upon us and a need for forgiveness. And where it says he shall bear her iniquity, it means he shall enter in her place. And from this, the sages say that if you cause your friend to sin, not just a spouse, if you cause your friend to sin, like it said in the Al-Khayt, things that I've led others into, then you enter their place for all punishments. That's why we got to be so careful when we go around teaching the word and proclaiming the word, or thinking that we can fix somebody else's understanding and observance of the word. Think of all the teaching we received that was wrong, and the people we trusted actually caused us to sin. Ouch. But you know what? We can do the exact same thing. We can start teaching the word before we fully understand the word. And what does James say? Not many of you should be teachers. Why? Because you're going to have the greater condemnation. If they're going to go out sinning because of something you advise them to do, oh, this is what it says in the word, and they're out there sinning left and right because of what you said, then basically it's saying, then you get their punishment. Yikes. Yikes. That should make us back way off. Right? We should make sure that this is as cut and dried and plain. And of course, we always think that. But if you can visualize words coming out of mouths as concrete things, then you can begin to understand that you're also sharing in the punishment if you misspeak. I did a post, I forget what day it was, on the words that come out of our mouth. I put it on Facebook. I didn't put it in the newsletter. I'll probably put it in this week's newsletter. And because I had taken a passage, actually out of a law enforcement book, where it talks about building a team and how you don't want to build a team with somebody who's habitually late, because if you're on a team, that's a social contract. And I'm guaranteeing you, by being part of the team, that unless something unforeseeable arises that is not under my control, whether I sleep late is under my control, whether I schedule too many things in a day is under my control. There's a lot of things under my control. Now, if I have a wreck on the way to the meeting, probably not under my control. Well, it could have been, but I didn't anticipate that. And so it says, don't build a team with someone who's habitually late or sloppy, because the whole team will suffer. They will stand around wasting time waiting on one person. And So the difficulty is a lot of times this person who's habitually late is very gifted and talented. But just because you're gifted and talented does not mean you have the right to steal time from other people. You keep that social contract. You keep that work contract. You keep that agreement that says, if the group is going to be here at a specific time, then my body's going to be here at a specific time. Oh, I remember. I wrote that. I posted that. And then I realized, I think we're going to be late for Shabbat service. We weren't, but I was checking, like, we got 6 minutes, we got to get there, because I wrote this and I'm going to end up being late for Shabbat service. But he was talking about people who this is their habit, this is their normal, not something that's abnormal. If somebody's normally on time, that's not who they're talking about. We're talking about the person, we all know who they are, that late or sloppy is normal. Now, most people, if they're late or they're sloppy, we start worrying because we know something's wrong. So keeping your word, keeping your vows, that's very important. Just like the tribes of Gad and Reuven, they wanted their inheritance on the other side of the Jordan, and Moses reminds them, you have to keep your word. And he goes into pretty good detail. If we start reading it in Hebrew, he gets pretty tough with them. Like, you give your word. You make this social contract with these other 10 tribes, and you've got to execute it to your own hurt. And so they spent 7 years helping the other tribes to divide the land before they were free to go back home. They basically built cities and pens for their children and for their livestock, and then they were on the front lines for the next 7 years. Let's see. We also have, again, and we did this when we looked at the 144,000, so we don't need to go over it again. You can actually go pull that out of the newsletter archives and read it over if you don't remember it. But basically, that Moses tells them to go take vengeance on the Midianites. What Pinchas started, Pinchas was allowed to finish because he became the war priest who would go out with the army. And it says, and Pinchas, son of Eleazar the Cohen, to the army and the sacred vessels and the trumpets for sounding under his authority. So there again, there's another beautiful little picture we've got for Revelation. As the trumpets start to sound, we've already made the connection of Bilam and the Midianites and taking vengeance for that as the 144,000 are sealed from the 12 tribes. And so Matot gives us another little hint here. It's comparing it to the situation of a war priest. And within, it says literally the hand. It says biyado, in the hand of his, Pinchas, authority. So that zeal, remember Yeshua quoting, the zeal for the Father's house has consumed me. That's pretty much based in this zeal of Pinchas. And so the same zeal of Pinchas, we can say, applies to Yeshua, because he goes in there, remember, with the scourge, with the whip, into the temple area. Why? Because remember, they're selling specifically doves. In this Torah portion, the rabbis say what's happened, they're running back into Bilam again. He should have gone home and hid. But they say Bilam came back to get payment for his impotent cursing. I'm not sure exactly what he was charging for, maybe just job expenses, I don't know, mileage, but he certainly didn't deliver on the curse, but he did deliver on teaching them how to do it themselves. And so they're going to kill Bilam, but it's going to be under the leadership and the authority of Pinchas, who has that zeal. when Yeshua goes into the temple and overturns the money changers' tables, remember, it's a matter of exchanging money. Remember the long conversation they had way back in that Torah portion about how much money they were willing to pay Bilam to come do the curse? The other item that mentions specifically is doves. Doves. Yonah is a dove in Hebrew, right? Okay, remember Jonah goes to Nineveh, he goes to the nations, and he preaches, and they repent. So what does a dove represent on Yom Kippur? The nations like Nineveh who would repent. Remember Yeshua telling people the men of Nineveh would rise up in judgment against you if they had heard and seen what you have heard and seen. Right? So it's a little hint back to the nations. It says in the prophets, who are these who fly like doves back to their lattices? Remember the doves flying back to Israel? Again, the exiles among the nations coming back to Israel. So who are they exchanging? Remember, the whole point of the money exchange is, see, the Gentiles didn't have enough sense to know the rules of the temple. And so they would give money thinking that the Sadducee priests would go ahead and make their sacrifices for them. It was a house of prayer for all nations. But instead, because they didn't know the fine points of the rules, they didn't specifically ask. You had to ask. And you had to specifically designate and say, I want you to make this sacrifice for me. If they didn't say the right words, then they could take that money and slide it right over here into this fund. It was a trick. And so they were playing a trick on the Gentiles. And Yeshua says, no, my Father's house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. You're selling these doves. But what are you selling? You're selling the hope of the nations for commercialism, so you can line your pockets. So the Sadducees, under at least the implicit approval of the house of Shammai, not the house of Hillel. The house of Shammai, because remember, the house of Hillel welcomed the exiles. They welcomed the stranger. They welcomed the Gentile to come in and learn and to convert, but not the house of Shammai. So the house of Shammai and the Sadducees in cahoots were using those money changers' tables and the doves to squash the prophecy of the nations that we see in Revelation, every nation, tribe, and tongue at Yom Kippur. They become part of Israel. And so as those trumpets are sounding, it makes sense. It says it's in the hand of Pinchas. Well, the trumpet sound in Revelation, the one who has the zeal for the Father's house like Pinchas is going forth. That's Yeshua. Let's see, we don't want to hear about the flying Midianites, do we? That was one of okay. They say that Bilam was such a good magician that he could make the Midianites fly. Okay, I'm giggling, but I'm not being sarcastic. All right. We've talked about becoming unclean because of a corpse. If you touch a corpse, then you have to purify yourself on the third day and on the seventh day. And that's why I think a lot of people are misunderstanding when they read in the New Testament where it talks about for those who are immersed for the dead. And they think, what's going on here? How can you be baptized for the dead? Well, if you've touched the corpse, then you need to immerse on the third and the seventh day. Especially if you killed the person. In this particular Torah portion, it's important because the warriors have killed. Leharog is the Hebrew word for killing. If you've killed a person, then that soul, that nefesh, is still going to be hovering around there. And if you're touching the corpse for 3 to 7 days, you see, because they expect that nefesh, that soul, to hover around for 3 days. So you're going to immerse on the 3rd, and then just to make sure, you're going to immerse on the 7th. And I think there's deeper things than that, if we had the time to go into it. Instructions there again about purifying things. It goes from how to purify your army once they've touched corpses to how to purify vessels. And I guess we can, I don't think there was anything. After that, this might be the last thing that I think would be important. And by the way, I mean, I'll pop that picture up here in a minute so you can see it. Even though in this Torah portion, Gad and Reuven received their inheritance on the other side of the Jordan, when we look at Ezekiel's partitioning, that's not exactly where they are. They're actually, and like I say, I'll pull that picture up where you can see it. So there seems to be a change. Like, that concerned me when I read it, because they were like, okay, the land itself crossing over the Jordan is like crossing into the lower garden. That in the spiritual realm is the picture there. So if they're saying we don't want to go in, we'll go in and help you get yours, but we want ours outside the garden, that doesn't make any sense. But in Ezekiel's drawing, they're actually in. So there again, I think there's deeper topics to explore in that. But I wanted to kind of unpack, how's my time? Okay, I'm over. I'll hurry. Chapter 31, verse 23. It says, and it's referring to metals, metal utensils. Everything that comes into fire, you shall pass through the fire, and it will be purified. But it must be purified with the waters of sprinkling. And everything that does not come into the fire, you shall pass through waters. You shall immerse your garments on the 7th day and become purified. Afterward, you may come into the camp. All right, and I haven't always understood this in terms of, and a lot of these rules, if you've ever been around an Orthodox family where they might be koshering utensils, especially before Passover, if they're trying to use the same utensils, some they get rid of the old ones for a week and they just have a special Passover set of plates or whatever. You kind of get where they're getting this from. But the question here, because like, okay, it passes through the water, it passes through the fire. Does that mean its ability to pass through water and fire? And they're saying that's not what that means. It says, how do you normally use the vessel? What do you normally do with it? Because whatever you're doing with the vessel is how you're going to cleanse the vessel. Right? So you're going to purge this vessel in the same manner that it is used. So if this is a vessel that you use to cook, say, hot water, if you use it to boil water or soup, then you purge it with hot water. You purge it with boiling water. If you use it to roast things, let's say your grill, right? Then you use the same thing. You use fire. It's not a matter of boiling it. It's a matter of passing it literally through the fire, because for the same use that you use the object, that's the same way it's purified. If it's something that is a cold, we'd call it a cold vessel. It's not something used for cooking or putting, like roasting. Then it shifts over and it talks about anything which is not used for cooking by fire, such as cups and jars, which are used with cold water, you pass through the waters. You immerse it in a mikveh. and that is enough to render it fit for use. Does that make sense? So when you're trying to figure out, like, if I want to truly kosher something, you don't necessarily need a blowtorch for everything. Right? In fact, if you use a blowtorch like it says on a garment, then you won't have a garment anymore. That's not how you normally use a garment. But if you want to ritually purify a garment, let's say you touched Great Aunt Debbie after she died. You helped her prepare for passing over. You were part of that team that washed her body and prepared her body for burial and so forth. You don't have to go burn your clothes, because that's not how you normally handle your clothes. All you have to do is to wash, to mikveh your garments with that intention. That it's not a normal washing. It's not like you just hit the wash cycle and walk away. You need to do it with intention. But again, if there was a metal instrument that you touched the corpse with, then again, you may want to pass that through boiling water. Right? And I'm not sure why. I've been reading this. I got stuff underlined, and I've looked at the Hebrew. I'm like, I still don't understand why. But the water and the fire. I never made that distinction. I just said, well, whatever it can handle. And that's still going to be true, but they're saying you have to look at what it was used for, and that's how you determine how you're going to make it pure again.